Thank you. So California Clean Money campaign has been working for over 20 years on reducing the influence of money in politics. Craig Dunkerley is a board member and the South State coordinator, and he'll give us a history of the successes and the inside look at the current legislature's efforts in California. Okay, Craig has a degree in mathematics and philosophy from Saturday State. Since 2004, he's been the South State coordinator for California Clean Money campaign in the South State, working to bring campaign finance reform to California elections. We've had several legislative wins in the last few years, starting with the Disclose Act and other bills. So, okay, Craig will give us an update. Okay. Hey.
So do you want to make any remarks before I share your PowerPoint?
Just to thank you for having me, and I'll give you a brief history of where we've been, and then we'll zero in on things that we're doing this year. So we can start the presentation now. All right, so just our title page, California Clean Money Campaign. We can be reached at that email address. You can also, Amy has my email address, and you're all welcome to reach out to me as well if you have specific questions. So these are, I'm sure you've all heard of Citizens United, and a now infamous Supreme Court decision that came down in January of 2010. These are the 5 culprits who we have to thank for opening the floodgates of money into our political system. Antonin Scalia is no longer with us, and Anthony Kennedy on the far right has since retired, but the other 3 are still there. We can see here the devastating impact that Citizens United has. If you look very closely at the bottom scale, you'll notice that the green line indicating the amount of money that was spent in elections over different election cycles. And then notice over almost at the far right, the year 2010, that was right after the Citizens United case passed. And as you can see there, money in politics and the influence that it has just exploded. Right? And this is why California Clean Money Campaign exists. It's to reduce the influence of all that money. Move to Amend, of course, is an allied organization that we keep tabs on each other and help each other whenever we can. 17 states have recognized the damage that Citizens United has done, and these 17 states have actually all passed resolutions in favor of a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. So the 2 basic problems that Citizens United created, first, it, as I mentioned, opened the floodgates of special interest money into the process. Most notably, the biggest addition that resulted from that decision was corporations can now make donations direct from their treasury. Before, they could only, their officers, their employees, their stockholders could make contributions to political campaigns as individuals, but the corporations were barred from using their immense political power to influence our political system directly. Citizens United basically opened up those floodgates. So now corporations can spend directly from their treasury. But another big part of the problem that we've been working on is the fact that not only is all this money being spent, but the lion's share of the time, it was, at least in California, being spent anonymously, hence the term dark money. So yeah. not only are all these all this money floating around anonymously, but it's also very hard to track because they launder it through various organizations. One organization will give to another organization, which will give to a nonprofit, which will give to another PAC, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's very difficult to figure out where the money actually came from. When I first saw this slide, I thought it was just a joke. to illustrate the point, but it's actually real. And the money in this particular network, which I've never successfully managed to track all the way through, actually was part of the Koch brothers network. And in 2012, it was a way that they were able to pull together and spend over $400 million in that 2012 election cycle. So the money goes through many layers, and that there's a huge amount of it being spent anonymously. These are the two things that California Clean Money has worked on, and at least in California has successfully managed to push back on. So for starters, in 2014, we were able to get a bill, SB 27, passed, and that at least required these dark money groups to report who their actual funders were to the Secretary of State. So at least getting the information as far as the Secretary of State's office, they could no longer hide behind all of these euphemistic sounding names. They had to actually reveal who their true funders were. And again, at least this information got as far as the Secretary of State. So it wasn't quite as dark. But that still doesn't help voters much. We're still getting barraged with all these ads. And as far as the voters could tell, the funders were still pretty much hidden unless you were extremely good at doing research and digging through the files of the Secretary of State's website. In 2014, big money was still holding sway in most elections. In 2014, the side that won spent 18 times as much as the side that lost. So money was still having a major influence. It still does, but fortunately it doesn't do it in quite as much darkness as it used to. In 2014, most of that spending was still hiding behind these euphemistic names. So let's see what can be done about that at the next slide. Actually, this is a couple examples. They used to be able to, under the old so-called disclosure laws, they would make disclosures like this, but they could do things at that time like put, pale gray letters on an even paler gray background. They could also print everything in caps, which makes it much harder for the eye to read. And they could also hide behind, very euphemistic sounding names, like in this case, Citizens for an On-Time Budget. Who could be against that, But the true funders of that were very much hidden from voters. Let's see another example on the next slide. This is another example. They weren't required, there were no particular requirements for what the background had to be for these disclosures under the old law. So once again, they could have a very confusing background, which makes it difficult for the reader to read what's in there. But even if you could read it, it still says they use these euphemistic names. In this case, this ad was paid for by Stop Hidden Taxes. Again, that certainly sounds like a good thing. We'll say more about Prop 26 as we go along here, but I'll reveal to you who the true funders of that were and what that ballot measure was really all about. So California Clean Money Campaign got to work on disclosure, and as you may imagine, and as many of you who have helped in our campaign have learned, it definitely takes perseverance. You got to stick with it. But we did, and over a course of several years, we gathered endorsements from 350 different organizations, leaders, and editorial boards. We gathered over 100,000 petition signatures from the public who we were educating about these problems. Tens of thousands of emails, thousands of phone calls, many of which Amy made, and hundreds of packing hearing rooms in Sacramento when these bills would come up for a hearing, something that Amy also helped us out with. And it paid off. In 2017, finally, we got the California Disclose Act passed. It's our flagship bill. And once we made it over that initial hump, Subsequent success was a little bit easier to attain, as we'll see here in the next few minutes. But this was our big flagship bill that we got passed finally in 2017. It was and is the first bill in the nation to clearly disclose the top funders of ads in the ad, so you don't have to go searching for it anywhere. You may have noticed in recent years, ballot measures, even now we're starting to see some of them on TV. The black band that appears at the bottom of the screen, if you go to the bottom few lines of that black box, you'll see who the true funders are who funded that ad. Regardless of what the name of the committee may sound like, you can see who the true funders were. And that's true no matter how many layers the money had to go through in order to finally fund that ad. I won't go into the details, but the bill has mechanisms in it for tracking the money, no matter how many different organizations it flows through before it finally gets to the one that runs the ad. So now we can reveal who the Stop Hidden Taxes, who that group really was and who were their top funders. And once I tell you what the proposition was about, it won't surprise you that the principal funders were Chevron, Philip Morris, and Anheuser-Busch, some of our largest corporations. Prop 26 was a very innocuous sounding bill that was going to make it more difficult for the California legislature and local governments to raise certain fees. And it, that sounded, like a good thing. Like, as taxpayers, gee, it'd be good if it was a little harder for our elected officials to raise taxes and fees. What voters didn't know was, number one, they didn't know that those were the fees that were used to fund all of California's environmental policies and environmental laws. So that really hamstrung California's efforts to lead in environmental action. The other thing that voters didn't know before the Disclose Act was that Stop Hidden Taxes was really funded primarily by, as you can see there, Chevron, Philip Morris, and Anheuser-Busch. So this is an example of what disclosures on many ads now actually reveal, and it gives voters a better chance of making a better informed decision. So, very brief history. The bad old days, we already talked about those. In 2017, we did pass, as I mentioned, the California Disclose Act, and it required TV, radio, online, and print ads for ballot measures and money spent on independent expenditures for candidates to clearly show their top three funders. So that was the core of the California Disclose Act. Since then, as you make the disclosure requirements on certain kinds of advertising more robust, one of the things that political advertisers do is they'll search for other ways that they can advertise that maybe aren't so carefully regulated. So in quick succession in 2018, we noticed that a lot of political ads were moving to social media, which at that time was not covered by the Disclose Act. So we proposed and passed the Social Media Disclose Act. So that's like Facebook and YouTube and various other places. But still, these guys are very crafty. Then we started to notice that they were moving a lot of their political advertising to text messages. So even your text messages, weren't safe from these things. So in 2019, we proposed and got passed the Text Message Disclose Act, which made similar requirements for disclosure of funders in text messages. And then pretty soon here, we're going to move into a discussion of what we're currently doing. Our current bill, there's two of them. The first one we're going to talk about is the Disclosure Clarity Act. And basically, this helps to correct some of the abuses of the existing laws that you see there above. So these are some examples of the kinds of abuses that are possible even under the current Disclose Act requirements. So the first one, the California Disclose Act specified said very specifically what font you had to use. Unfortunately, there are several different types of that font, and some of them are extremely narrow. I noticed these on a lot of times on movie posters. The print at the bottom, I don't know why they do this, but it's very narrow. I guess they're trying to squeeze in as much information as they can, but it makes it very difficult for the eye to read. So that's one way that they've abused the current regulations. The next one there at the bottom is that they make the committee name really long, which then allows them under the current law to reduce the font size on the bottom part, which is the most important part, where they actually reveal who the top funders are. So that's another abuse that they were able to do under the current law. And actually those were corrected in 2018 with one of our, we call them Disclose Act cleanup bills. Very often when you pass legislation, you need to go in periodically and update it or change things or refine certain regulations. And so we did that in 2018 to fix those last couple of abuses that we talked about. Now we can look at some more recent abuses. This is an example of a more current abuse, which we're now seeking to correct with this year's legislation. Here's another example of how they make these committee names so long, it's really hard to get through all of that and finally make your way down to the very bottom where they actually list the top 3 funders. And unfortunately, under the current law, there isn't a way to prevent them from doing that. So it's kind of a way for them to work around the intentions of the law. Next page. Another example of really long committee names. Just time yourself for 5 seconds. Try to read that whole black box in 5 seconds. If you're like me, that's pretty tough. And once again, you don't really make it to the top funder list until you get down to the bottom. So these really long committee names are a problem. And I think we're going to correct that on the next slide. Yes. So this is what our new bill, the Disclosure Clarity Act, which is SB 1360. It will address this problem. So first of all, the committee names are limited to the top 3 lines. So if they want to go on and on and on with, some elongated committee name, they can, but it's restricted to the top 3 lines. Then one of our board members came up with this great idea: make the funders listed at the bottom a contrasting color. So under our new law, the funders will be set apart in 2 ways. One, you'll notice that there's a half line of space between the white letters and the yellow letters. So that also helps to alert the voter and the viewer to where they can find this information. And it's also, if we pass this bill, it will now be in a contrasting color. Much easier for the voter and the viewer to figure out, A, that the top funders are listed, and B, where they can look for them and find them quickly, because this disclosure only appears on the screen for about 5 seconds. This, we think, will make a big difference and be a big advantage to voters and viewers in figuring out who's really paying for these ads. Okay, in addition, there are some other abuses. So those are primarily abuses of TV ads. These are some abuses that we've seen on online ads. Believe it or not, in all 3 of those ads, those are real life examples, there is wording that says, who funded these ads? Can you find them? It's like, where's Waldo? Can you find them? I don't want to keep you in suspense. So in the top one, right above the word politicians, you may be able to make out very faintly, it says there, paid political advertisement. And then still on that top one, below the blue box, very faintly, I can't even read it. It's so faint. But this is what they were doing. They were getting away with the current law specifies a certain percentage of the ad space that needs to be taken up with these things. but they'll do things like split them up. So if the total is 5% of the ad space, well, they'll split it up into 2.5% things, so that and then they're still doing things like putting very faint letters on very faint backgrounds, which makes them very hard to read. In the middle one, that narrow one, the narrow ad for Prop 22, once again, if you look really hard in the top right corner, you'll see a live link that says who funded ad. And if the viewer were to somehow see that and click on it, then it would take them to the necessary information. And the bottom one, the more squarish one, there again, if you look really hard in the top right corner, you'll see it says who funded this ad. So they printed the correct wording as required by law, but they figured out ways to make it so difficult to find and so hard to read that it was pretty much useless. So our proposed solution, I believe, is on the next slide. So just using that top one as an example, now what used to be in very faint letters up above the word politicians at the top, now it would have to appear either in an all white box with black letters, or the second example, you can reverse that and they can put it all white letters in an all black box. So either one is okay. However, in addition to the right end of that white or black box, in a contrasting color, they have to add in bold type, add committee's top funders, colon, the name of that top funder, and then a live link that will take them to the list of other funders. In the one on the bottom, where it's the white letters on the black box, the add committee top funders, again, are in bold. In this case, they're in yellow. Again, so it's easier for the eye to see. So with those improvements, we think a lot more voters will be able to A, notice them, and B, find who's really funding these things if they care to. Next slide. Okay, so now we have another bill, a really important bill called the Ballot Disclose Act. It's AB 1416. And the key to this one, it's a little different type of disclosure. Instead of disclosing money or where the money comes from, this one is about disclosing to voters who supports and who opposes ballot measures, and doing so right on the ballot. So why do we need the Ballot Disclose Act? What would be the purpose or motivation for this? Info about who supports and opposes or organizations that support or oppose a given ballot measure is hard to find and difficult to remember. Does anybody know where you can actually find that information? I bet somebody in this group does. Anybody know? Holler it out. You can find it in the voter guide, that usually about 100-page tome that you get, and I'm sure every one of you read every single word of that. And if you do, you'll get to the section where they have arguments for the proposition, arguments against the proposition, arguments rebutting the argument for, arguments rebutting the argument against. Well, all those arguments, the proponents of those different arguments are very careful about picking who's going to sign those ballot arguments, because they want to pick organizations and or individuals that they think will have the most name recognition and or the most positive impact on anybody reading those arguments. They can see, well, who's making these arguments? You know, who's saying this? So this bill would have nothing to do with picking who those names are. We don't interfere in that process at all. All we want to do is put that information about who supports a proposition and who opposes it in a place that's much easier to find and much easier to use, and much more likely to help voters make an informed decision. So, for example, over $750 million was spent on California ballot measures in 2020, mostly by special interest groups that voters had never heard of. Even when they're disclosed on the TV ads, you know, they're usually not the ones that the voters would most readily recognize. And then campaigns supported or opposed by organizations people trust are too often drowned out by big money. So voters don't know who really supports and opposes good or bad ballot measures. So part of the motivation for this bill, getting this information printed right on the ballot, right next to each ballot proposition, is because organizations that people trust can be a big help to voters when they're trying to decide, do I want to vote for this thing or not? I've read through the voter guide, and as often as not, I'm as or more confused when I finish than I was when I started. And so I suspect, like many of you, I'll go to I'll search on the web and try to find out, well, where do organizations that I trust stand on this particular ballot measure? Because they do understand the ramifications, and they've got staffs of attorneys that dig into this stuff and who know whether this proposition is well crafted or not well crafted, and who know what some of the unintended or intended consequences might be. And if these are organizations that I've known for a long time or that I've come to trust, then where they stand on that ballot measure can be a big help to me as a voter. So, but we wanted to be sure that this was really true. It seemed intuitive to us that this information would be really handy to have on the ballot. So we did some polling. And yes, on the left-hand side there, you'll see that overall, 79% of voters said that, yes, we would really, with that information about who supports and who opposes these ballot measures, that would be very important information to us. It can be very helpful when we're trying to make a decision. And interestingly, the columns to the right are basically just a breakdown. So it actually goes across all political lines. 84% of Democrats favored it, 80% of Republicans favored it, 70% of independents favored it. So overall, on average, 79%, but it played very well. It was very appealing across the political spectrum. This one, how hard is it to find this information? Well, you can see here that a much smaller percentage thought it was easy to find than those who thought, almost 2/3 thought, found it difficult to find. Many that were asked didn't even realize the information was in the voter guide. So they didn't think it was easy to find or that that information could be readily had. And then where would the voters like to have this information? So the initial polling we did, we found out that, yeah, voters really think that would be valuable information to have. Where would they prefer to have it? Because since it is a little hard to find now. And once again, on the left, we see the overall polling results. 75% of voters said that they'd prefer to have that information right on the ballot, as opposed to just other places or in the voter guide. And once again, it plays well across the political spectrum. So whether you're a Democrat or Republican or an independent, California Clean Money Campaign, as a footnote here, it does our best to be nonpartisan. It plays well across the spectrum. 80% of Democrats wanted to see it on the ballot. 72% of Republicans would like to see that information on the ballot. 70% of independents said the same thing. So 75%, 3/4, said not only would we like to have that information, it'd be very helpful, but where we'd like to have it most, where we'd prefer to have it, where it would be the handiest, would be on the ballot itself. The importance of, so we're going to go back to that Prop 26 that I told you about earlier, where the proposition was to make it much more difficult for legislatures, local and state, to raise certain kinds of fees. And what voters didn't know at the time and didn't realize was that those are the fees that funded all of our environmental protection programs. So unfortunately, because voters didn't know that, and they also didn't know who actually funded the campaign, that proposition passed anyway after the fossil fuel industry and other large corporations spent over $18 million in ads, billing themselves as a group called Stop Hidden Taxes. That thing passed anyway, and that's made our environmental protection efforts much more difficult. If the Ballot Disclose Act had been in effect at the time, would it have made a difference? Well, as you can see here, the the bottom part is the part that our bill would add. So the top part is determined by the Attorney General, and also the Secretary of State has a hand in determining what the possible financial impact would be. What we want to add is just what you see there. Supporters, California Taxpayers Association, California Chamber of Commerce, Small Business Action League, NISI Farmers League. Opponents, League of Women Voters, California American Lung Association, Sierra Club of California, California League of Conservation Voters. If we'd had the Ballot Disclose Act at the time, and if voters had been able to see this right on the ballot, instead of passing by 52.5% vote, do you think that maybe just 3% of voters might have voted differently if they had known this information? If they had had that information when they made that final decision about how to mark their ballot? We think that it might very well have made a difference. And in any case, we know from polling that voters would like to have this information. So exactly how the voter ends up voting once they have this information obviously is up to them. But we think, and voters, people polled agree, that they'd like to have that information before they make their final decision and mark that ballot. What tends to happen if voters see on the ballot that a measure is opposed by an organization that they trust, such as Prop 26, which was opposed by League of Women Voters and several other groups that probably most of us would tend to trust. Well, on the left is the before, and on the right is the after. The after represents if the same person being polled is asked this question of whether they would support a particular ballot measure, without knowing that it was opposed by an organization they trust. When they found out that it was opposed by an organization they trusted, you can see there the yes vote in blue went way down and the no vote went way up, as you might expect. What happens if voters see that a ballot measure is supported by an organization that they trust? Will it have a similar kind of effect? This one is a little bit not quite as obvious, but if you look at the yes vote before the person being asked this question knew that the proposition was supported by an organization they trust, 64% would have voted yes. If they had known that it was supported by an organization they trust, it went even higher. Even more people, another 9% of voters who had previously voted no would actually have voted yes if they had realized that an organization they trusted supported it. So knowing whether an organization that you trust is for it or against it seems to have a very important effect on helping voters make better informed decisions. Okay, I probably won't go through all of these, but these are a few examples from 2020, very recently, of things where the Ballot Disclose Act might have made a difference. Prop 15 was the one that had to do with reforming the Prop 13 property tax law in California. Many of you probably know that that has turned out to be a huge windfall for big corporations, because big corporations don't buy and sell property, like individual homeowners, like residential homeowners do. So this bill would have, which had polled very well, and it was leading in the early polls. It had really strong support to not change the Prop 13 as it applied to residential homes, but to start making corporations pay their fair share. The Ballot Disclose Act would have shown that Prop 15 was supported by the League of Women Voters, California Teachers Association, and Latino Community Foundation. We think it's very likely that, and it fell short at 48%. It only needed another couple of percent to win. If voters had known the groups that, when you say raise property taxes, which of course all the ads said, in fact, $144 million worth of ads told voters that, oh, they're going to raise your taxes, blah, blah, blah. Well, that wasn't true, but it's First Amendment stuff, so you can't stop them from saying whatever they want to say. If voters had been able to see right on the ballot that some of these trusted organizations were in favor of it, we think there's a good chance that it would have passed. And that would have made a huge difference to California's fiscal survival and fiscal thriving. I'm going to go to 22. This was the one that the legislature had passed legislation, California, that required Uber and Lyft to treat and compensate their drivers as employees instead of being able to get away with calling them independent contractors. Calling them independent contractors dramatically increases the tax burden on the driver, and also deprives the driver of a number of other benefits that they would have if they were an employee. So the legislature passed a bill that would require these companies to treat their drivers as employees and not as independent contractors. Along comes a whole group of mostly Uber and Lyft. They spent over $200 million on deceptive ads, outspending the opponents by 10 to 1. The Ballot Disclose Act would have shown voters that the opposition, the strong opposition from trusted groups like the ACLU of Southern California, California League of Conservation Voters, California Teachers Association, California Professional Firefighters. Once again, this would have helped voters make a much better informed decision. You know, when a voter is faced with all this overwhelming avalanche of ads that say one thing, but then they see trusted organizations that they know who are opposing it, it really helps them make a better informed decision. And I'll spare you the others, but these are all good examples of how the Ballot Disclose Act would have helped. Next slide. So the current status of our two bills. The Disclosure Clarity Act, this is the one that will fix a lot of the ongoing abuses that we continue to find as time goes by, and periodically we need to go in and tweak things. That bill will be in the Senate. It's already passed the Assembly. I'm sorry, it'll be in the Senate Elections Committee in March or April. And we're hoping that it will pass out of there, that it'll get a favorable vote on the Senate and then move on to the Assembly. So we're pulling for that one. And the other big one, the Ballot Disclose Act that we were just talking about, passed the Assembly in January on a bipartisan vote of 57 to 19. So once again, it's having a cross-party approval and favorable reception. And it will be move on to the Senate Elections Committee in June or July. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that. Next slide. And here this will wrap us up. And you know, how can you help clean money beat dark money? Basically, there's three pretty simple things you can do. If you think our cause is worthy, you can have your group endorse SB 1360 and AB 1416. That's the Disclosure Clarity Act and the Ballot Disclose Act. Number two, you can go to our website, yesfairelections.org, there in blue, and you can sign the petition showing that you support that. We use those signed petitions to show the elected official, the legislators in Sacramento, that we've got broad grassroots support for this stuff. And then, of course, you can donate if you don't have the time or whatever to donate, and you can donate some funds. Deeply appreciated. We are all nonprofit. We are all of us are volunteers. We do this because we think it's important for our democracy. And if and when you do those things, then watch your email for action alerts, because they will come and your help is very much appreciated. The end. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Joan.
There we go.
I know that in the past there have been, meetings that I used to go to. I don't know, maybe long ago, large meetings. So what's happening now in terms of volunteers and getting the word out like you are tonight and things like that?
Yeah. So during the first 7 or 8 years that I was active in California Clean Money Campaign, we were working on what still is our bigger and long-term goal of public financing of campaigns. And as a consequence, we were going out to all kinds of fairs and festivals and whatnot, and collecting signatures and educating people and whatnot. And we'd have big meetings, where we would plan strategy, and we would see, who can show up and who can fill this time slot at this particular fair and whatnot. In 2010, when our second effort for public financing of campaigns came up short, even though we did quite a bit better than we had the first time, we realized that, before we can really hope to push this thing over the majority threshold, we're going to have to do something about all the misleading political ads that are out there. So we switched gears at that point to working on all these disclosure bills. And we didn't know, probably a good thing, we didn't know at the time how long it was going to take, but it's probably just as well. And now we've obviously, with the success we've had in the last few years, we're doing much better. And so now, before the pandemic, our focus was mostly on, we'd have monthly meetings, and we would mostly kind of bring people up to speed on where our latest disclosure bill was how it was doing. And then we'd make arrangements to go to Sacramento to attend various hearings as these bills would come up before the different committees. Once the pandemic hit, we still needed to pursue our legislation, but we weren't able to go to Sacramento and pack hearing rooms. And so the need for monthly meetings kind of wasn't there. And so we didn't want to waste people's times, by having meetings where there was really not a lot to do. So we haven't been having them. But when and if the pandemic allows, we'll be able to go back to having periodic trips to Sacramento and packing those hearing rooms, which is a lot of fun if you've never done it.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Karen was just saying that another example of misleading ads was really against the housing, the rent control that we had.
Yeah.
In San Jose, but it was
Yeah.
so misleading.
Yep.
And
Another good example.
Mm-hmm.
And here again, the Ballot Disclose Act would have let voters see who was funding that effort, and that would have helped voters make, better decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And we have no delusions, that we know what's best, for the voter to do, and that's not our mission. Our mission is to help voters have the information, the critical information they need to help them make better informed decisions. And then, of course, they'll do with that information whatever they think best, and that's as it should be.
I'm so glad you have the goal of eventually public funding with a set amount, and that's it. That's always been my idea.
Yeah,
I don't want any money in it, no money.
exactly. And we're close. We're close. We've got a strategy mapped out, and this group of disclosure bills that we're working on now are critical to that strategy. But we haven't lost sight of, and everybody in the movement, is anxious to get back to our main long-term goal, which is and continues to be public financing of campaigns. So disclosure of where political ad funding comes from is part and parcel of, it's a building block, in building toward that effort.
So, any more?
Well, it's been great fun. I really appreciate you guys having me. Feel free to reach out with any questions that you might have, or you think of, right afterwards. Feel free to distribute the slides wherever you want, along with my contact information, for anybody that might want it. And really appreciate all the work that you guys do too. Lord knows we need it. So
when it's time to do something,
mm-hmm.
People need to be on an email list.
And they can do that by going to our website, yesfairelections.org. And you can
Great.
sign a petition there. If you care to, you can make a donation if you think our cause is worthy. And you can, and that way you'll get the action alerts, you know,
Great.
as they come out. Sometimes, you know, it's making phone calls, you know, in this day and age of the pandemic. Sometimes we can't go to Sacramento, but we can make phone calls to people who live in the district of whoever's legislators vote we need on that particular day. So there's various ways to skin this cat, and we make use of all the tools that we have.
We do Twitter storms, and we do, were you doing texting? I think we're doing texting.
Yeah,
now.
we do some texting storms too.
Yes. So when do you think you're gonna have the meetings again?
Again, it's pretty much pandemic controlled, because the pandemic is what will determine whether or not we can make the periodic trips to Sacramento, and organizing those periodic trips is the principal reason for having meetings these days.
Oh,
So watch your email, and we'll keep you posted.
good, yes.
you.
Thank you, yay.
And you know, we succeed in large part because of folks like Amy, who they're just always there, you know.
I don't do that much, thank you.
We so
A lot of
appreciate
people
it.
do a lot, you do a lot.
All righty. Take care, guys.
All right, bye, thank
you.
you.